Rebecca, Lillian, and I live in Malmö, Sweden. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, USA, North America, the world, the universe, the mind of God. That's from Our Town by Thornton Wilder. I don't know if you didn't know. But I grew up in Evanston for the most part, which is not a suburb of Chicago, but right next to Chicago. Evanstonians are very proud of our being our own little city, but next to Chicago, as you know, because I think you know. But in any case, the first 5.5 years of my life were in Chicago, and the reason they're important before we moved to Evanston in terms of my spiritual journey is I have so many positive memories of the synagogue we belonged to when I was very young, Anshe Emet, which has had a repeat performance in my life over the years. It's kind of funny. But when I was very young, 4 or 5, I was part of this experimental educational program there where we learned Hebrew when we were 4 and 5, actually how to say things in Hebrew, speak a little bit of Hebrew. And that experience, I think, impacted me a lot because I can still remember Mrs. Sylvia Goldstein, the teacher from 50 years ago, teaching us things. And the Hebrew language is very important to me. Language in general and learning languages is, but that was really my first experience with learning a new language and specifically learning Hebrew. My parents were so important in my life, and they died really, really young, tragically young, both of them. At this point, I have lived more than half my life without my father, and my mother died in 91, so coming on 22 years without my mother. And at this point, having no parents, being orphaned is such a big part of my life, and I don't know how much of it is missing my parents as individuals and just living in the world with no parents and no grandparents and very, very few relatives at all older than I am, other than some cousins who are a few years older, but of the next generation, very few relatives. That has had such an impact on me and how I've moved through life, that it sometimes gets hard even to separate that out from who my parents were as individuals. But I think my parents were extraordinary individuals, and that I learned from each of them different things, great things that have really helped me through life. And also from their relationship, because something that I learned more after they died than when they were alive, because when I was a child, I wasn't so aware of my parents in a relationship, like children aren't, except of course when they were fighting. So I had, like I think many kids in adolescence, a skewed version of how often they fought. But especially after my father died, he was only 54, which is the age I am today, which is very intense for me. But some of his friends came over when we were sitting Shiva and talked about him and talked about how much he loved my mother. And that was like so incredibly important for me to hear. But this is jumping way ahead, but I guess, like you said, doesn't matter to my life. But one of the things that really impacted me when my father died, and my mother was only 51, my father died suddenly. He had a heart attack. And my mother really was debilitated by his death. My mother, it transformed her that he was gone, and gone so suddenly. And I made a decision, I think, at that moment, and I was aware of it by already, I would say, 5 to 7 years later, when I was around 30, that I was never, ever in my life going to have one person be so important to me, no matter how much I might love them, that I would lose it if they died. That somehow my life had to consist of people that I loved and loved me, people that I cared about and felt loved by. There had to be more than one. And I didn't know what that meant. Today I know what that meant, that has come to mean for me. I just knew it had to be because I felt so terrible for my mother, and there was nothing I could do. And there's nothing anybody could do. My childhood was, in retrospect, also one of those things that was, I think, amazing, and I didn't know at the time how amazing it was. I'm fortunate that in my life today I have friends who remember my parents from when we were kids. Either I stayed friends with them or we reconnected, who say wonderful things about my parents. And one of the things they always say is that they treated us like people, not like kids. Whatever age whether when we were, my sister's 3.5 years younger than I am, so whether we were, 7 and 10, or whether we were 10 and 13, that we were treated, not just we, but also my friends that came over, were treated like people of whatever age we were. I have a little brother. He came along much later. I was 11 when he was born. So it's sort of like I grew up in two families. There was the family that was my father, my mother, my sister, and me. My brother came along when I was 11. And then my father died when I was 23, my sister was 19, and my brother was 12. And my life is sort of divided. There was the family of the four of us, and then with the baby. And there was the family that was the four of us without my father, sort of muddling through emotionally. Oh, it's three families. And then there's the family that I'm in now of my family of origin, which is another thing that I've come to realize I am blessed and amazed by, because I've heard horror stories. As when I worked as a congregational rabbi, I saw horror stories of sibling hatred that puts the Bible to shame by how much the siblings hate each other. But somehow, I think my brother, my sister, and I made a decision when our mother died that we would be a family, somehow, some way, the three of us, three very, very different individuals that would likely have very little in common if we met somewhere that I can't even imagine where we would all meet. We're so different. And yet we decided to make a family because we are what we have. So, my family of origin it's not typical in terms of, nothing's typical, but I mean, it's different, but it's still to this day really important to me. My family I have to say one other thing about growing up before I move into today. Who I am is also deeply, deeply, deeply impacted by the woman who took care of us, Willie Mae. My mother was a physician, and she went back to work when I was 2 months old. And I was going to say there's like no real daycare options back then in 1959. There aren't. It hasn't gotten much better, sadly. It's much better in Sweden. But so she needed to find a nanny to take care of me. And she found this amazing woman through a nanny agency, Willie Mae, and she took care of us my whole life. And the joke in my neighborhood when I was growing up is when my brother was born, I was 11, my sister was 8. We were getting to sort of not need a nanny anymore, and people said the reason my mother had a third baby was in order to retain Willie Mae, because she was so important. And she remained a parental figure in my life past my parents' lifespan. She died at the age of 98 about 10 years ago. And she was an extraordinary woman, an extraordinary part of my spiritual journey. She was deeply, deeply religious. And she and I both had some sort of religious, spiritual sensibility that really meshed in a very deep way, that was not verbal. And she's, I think about her all the time in a really wonderful way. I stayed in touch with her after she retired and moved back to Alabama, where she was originally from. Visited her many, many times over the years, 10 or 15 years that she lived down there. My family today, I don't have any kids. So my family today is my partner Yen, and we've been together as a couple for about 20 years, a little less. But not having any children and not having any parents, going back to what I said about never wanting one person, I have always, it's always been very important to me to have friends who are like family. And so when I talk about my family today, I think about friends, who feel like family to me, and their children who feel like nieces and nephews to me. Because my sister has a son who I love very, very much, but he's my only flesh and blood nephew. And, Yen's brother has 2 kids, my niece and my nephew, but, I only saw them once a year until recently when we moved. Yen is from Copenhagen, very close to where we live now, across the bridge. But for the most of our relationship, Benjamin and Naomi, our niece and nephew, lived in Copenhagen. I lived in the United States. I saw them once a year, twice if I was lucky. So I don't have a day-to-day relationship with them. And now they're in their 20s and they're a part of my life, but they were not when they were kids. So having friends whose children are like my nieces and nephews is something I sought out and something, so I consider them part of my family. And my dog, she's, definitely, I've always had a dog. I grew up with a dog, and, that one is Ruby. And, I didn't mean to, but when I was 24, I said I'd take care of a dog that needed a home, a foster dog, and I ended up adopting her. And ever since then, most of the time I've had a dog. And, dog energy, dogness, dog love is important to me. And, that's where I've been. Oh, schooling. If, I make this as a joke sometimes, but it's true. I have been to school more than I've been, working in the workforce, and I'm very happy that way. And, if I could have arranged it so I never had to work and only was in school teaching or learning, I mean, it's silly because I could have done, people go to school and then they teach, but it hasn't always worked out that way for me. But I went to, after college, I went to graduate school, not to rabbinical school. I went to graduate school to study Jewish history and modern Jewish history. And I had always thought of, becoming a rabbi. I'd actually thought about it from, I don't know, I must have been 18 or 19 years old, because when I remember being at one of the synagogues where I grew up, we attended 3 different synagogues when I was a kid, and I was informed by every single one of them, and I think that's why I never fit in exactly anywhere, because there were wonderful things about each and things that did not resonate about each. But the place, Beth Emet, where I had most of my Jewish education as a child and my bat mitzvah, the rabbi who was there, David Polish, alav hashalom, when I was 18 or 19, I told him I was thinking of becoming a rabbi, and he said I should come talk to him. And then somehow I let go of that thought, because by the time I thought about it again, he was retired and not available. But I had I basically one of those people, there's a joke, it's apocryphal, maybe it got said one time, about a dean of a rabbinical school who had an entering class, and he said, "You're all here because you love Judaism. The challenge will be for you to love Jews." And it's not like I don't love Jews any more or less than other people, but the institution of the synagogue never resonated for me. So the idea of going to become something where I thought what I had to do was work in a synagogue all the time was odd. And yet I found myself working in the synagogue because when I graduated college, I didn't want to teach. I thought I had wanted to be a high school teacher. I walked into high school to do my student teaching, and I thought, what planet am I on? I hated high school. I couldn't wait to get out. I graduated high school a year early. I amassed enough credit, so I only had to be there 3 years. And being there as a student teacher was just like being there as a student. And I was the same height I am now, but maybe 30 pounds thinner. So I was smaller than most of the kids. They scared me. I was like, this is nuts. So I decided not to become a high school teacher. And so I graduated college, and I was prepared to do two things, to be a teacher or to go work in a synagogue because of all my volunteer work and everything I knew. So I could teach Hebrew school, and I had a job teaching Hebrew school, and then I was the youth director at a synagogue, and I found myself going in this path towards working in synagogues. And I went back to thinking about becoming a rabbi, and it was really that I wanted the knowledge that rabbis have, that I ultimately went to rabbinical school, not because I wanted to be a rabbi, whatever that meant. And so I was in graduate school studying Jewish history, thinking I would become an academic and teach in college instead of high school. And I met a woman who was a student at the school I eventually went to, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, RRC. And she said, I told her I was considering, but I didn't know. And she gave me the best advice that I was ever given for that and for other things. I've given similar advice when people are in a quandary. She said, why don't you take a leave of absence from your PhD program and come for 1 year to RRC, apply to the school, and if you get accepted, which she was sure that I would be, come and think of it as for a year. It's a 5-year commitment. She said, I said, how can I make a 5-year commitment? I don't know. She said, don't make a 5-year commitment. In your head, don't make a 5-year commitment, make a 1-year commitment. Don't quit your PhD program, take a leave of absence. And if you like the school, negotiate how you want to do it. Some people do both, or maybe you'll choose. That was really great, especially for somebody like me who, obviously, I didn't want to make one person the be all and end all of my familial life. I didn't want to make one school or degree. I mean, it was perfect for me. And so I went to spend my maybe 1 year, maybe 5 years. And for me, being in a rabbinical school, I was like a fish in water. It was those 5 years that I was at RRC. I don't want to say they were the best 5 years of my life because my mother became very ill and died during them. But the fact that happened while I was a student at RRC made RRC all the more important in my life because especially when I compare, my sister was also in graduate school at the same time when our mother died. She was getting her MBA. I was becoming a rabbi. And the way my classmates were, the outpouring of love and care when my mother got sick and when she died, people at the school that I wasn't particularly friendly with, but they heard what was going on, made sure when my mother was ill, and I had to fly back and forth a lot between Philadelphia and Chicago. I always had rides to the airport. I always had people picking me up. I mean, people, they were just wonderful. And one of the things that happened to me in rabbinical school, which I think has happened to quite a few rabbis, and I realized it was the case before I was thinking of going to rabbinical school. Ruby, I need to ask you to not bark like that. Come on. Come on. Good girl. Here. Is the community in rabbinical school, when it is done right, and it was done very, very well when I was at RRC, I think it models what a Jewish community can be like in a way that we then hopefully go out and serve communities and help people understand how important community is in Judaism. And for me, community is everything. To me, if you don't have a community, a spiritual community, it doesn't matter whether you keep kosher, it doesn't matter whether you keep Shabbat. I mean, the things that we do in Judaism, I've come to believe, are all about being in a spiritual community together. I certainly got that at school. That's the biggest lesson I got at school. There's a memory that I have that it's a memory I struggle with. It's not an easy memory. It feels related to this question. I don't know how. It's a memory that comes up a lot when I think about my family that was murdered in the Holocaust. But it has something to do with faith. Like many childhood memories, it's probably, I'm remembering it differently than it happened, but these are the things I remember. It was a Passover. It was right around the Passover holiday. And, my mother was combing knots out of my hair, which was a very frustrating experience. I had long hair. And I was trying to figure out who in the family was related to whom. It was confusing because my mother had first cousins, and we called them aunt and uncle, but they were my mother's first cousins and their spouses. They were male cousins and their wives. And then their kids were our cousins, and it was all very confusing to me. I was maybe six, I don't know. And, I kept saying, and then I think what was happening to me is that I think what was happening in the conversation is that my mother was trying to avoid talking about death and people being dead and maybe the subsequent questions of that they were killed in the Holocaust. And I was trying to figure out who was related to who. And I was trying to figure out why I knew I had a grandmother, but I didn't have a grandfather because my grandfather died before I was born. I knew this. He died. It wasn't about the Holocaust or anything. And I knew my cousins, my aunts and uncles didn't have parents, so my cousins didn't have grandparents. It was really confusing to me. And the part of the conversation I remember, I kept saying, who is Uncle David's mother? David was one of my mother's first cousins, and she said he doesn't have a mother. And I got so angry. And I started to cry, and I said, but everybody has a mother. Who is his mother? And I don't remember what happened after that. I don't remember what my mother said. I don't remember anything but that I started to cry and got angry. It was like this angry cry that you do when you're a kid. And I felt there was something I didn't understand about who I was connected to and connectedness. And I wanted to figure it out. And it had something to do with faith in that I had a feeling that if I found the right portal, if I found the right way of connecting, then maybe I would learn something about like who we were and why we were there and who was connected to who. And it had to be at some level that was not just about like who was whose mother and father, because like I was asking the wrong questions and I was not getting the answers that I wanted, and I was getting really angry and upset. And somehow I felt like I wasn't asking the wrong questions, and somehow that felt connected to this thing that used to happen to me, which, so even an earlier memory, around the same time, 5, 6 maybe, that we had a clock in my bedroom and it ticked very, very loudly. So I was up a lot at night because I had insomnia and anxiety, but I heard that clock tick a lot. And I didn't want to tell my mother to take it away because Willie Mae had given it to us, and I loved it. But it ticked very loud. And I used to think, okay, it's ticking, and time is going. And those two seem very related, that I was just not asking the right questions about time and connection, and that I needed to figure out what questions to ask so I would not be so frustrated. And that if I figured that out, I would know how we were all connected. And And I still struggle with that moment in the bathroom with my hair being combed and connection, that I can tap into that moment so readily. And I still don't know what it means exactly to me, like on a level of deeper consciousness, why I have such access to that moment in life that was almost 50 years ago at this point. But anyway, that was weird. I'll tell you the first thing that came to my mind. I don't know if it is or it isn't. And I will say, this is something I say a lot in life, but I'll say it here. I'm going to say the first thing that came to mind. And if you were reading in a book, you would already start to see a theme. But this is the first thing that came to my mind. When I was 11, one of my very best friends, her mother died. And that was my first experience with death of someone that wasn't supposed to die. Like my great uncle, who'd been like a grandfather to me, had died a few years previous, but he was of a generation people's grandparents died. I didn't know anyone whose mother died. That seemed wrong. I mean, I knew people died. And we were going to go over to her house and I was going to see her. I didn't know what to say. I had no idea what to say. I didn't want to go there because I was afraid that I wouldn't know what to say. I didn't know how to be her friend when her mother died. And so I prayed to God to know what to say. And to be able to go there, really, because it was so scary to me. And that's the first time I had I think I really felt that there was something out there. There was some sort of, that there are really hard things to do. To me, this was a really hard thing to do. It was really the hardest thing I had ever done up until that point, was to go be with my best friend, and her mother was dead. And I mean, and I just prayed to God to not say the wrong thing and to say the right thing and to help her somehow. And I think that was probably it. That was probably the time.
Do you remember what you said?
I remember the whole thing because I was so surprised. I went there and I was together with my parents, and they were friends with her parents. And I remember being alone with her, and I didn't say anything. I gave her a really, really big hug, and I didn't say anything at all. And then I was really surprised because she said, "Well, what do you want to do?" Those were the first words that were said. And I said, "Well, what do you want to do? This is really like whatever," I don't remember the words I used, but whatever is good for you, something like that. And of course, then we went on to do things that had nothing to do with her mother, and we didn't talk about her mother, and we ate ice cream, and we kind of ignored the fact that her mother died. So all my worrying we didn't talk about it at all right then.
What was the lesson for you?
The lesson in the whole experience. It's something I still do when I have to do something really hard that has to do with relating to people, which is really, to me, what's hard in life, is knowing how to relate to people at the right time, to say the right thing, is to go in first and to ask I always ask for the right, I ask to be a channel for saying the right thing and doing the right thing in that moment. That the wisdom is out there somewhere, not in here. If I spend too much time thinking, maybe I won't do or say the right thing, but that the wisdom is there. And that was, when I remember it, it's still a really important lesson. Remembering it is the hard part.
And what do you think is maybe not the first time, but the most important time in your life where you really had to rely upon God, or chose to rely upon God? Understand it.
The most important time was, well, there were two different times in my life, but that involved struggling with depression. But the most important time was the most recent time, 1997, 96, 97. I struggled with a very bad depression, and made worse because I saw that it was coming, and because I saw that it was coming, I knew what depression feels like. I could have made some decisions in my life that might have been better, but I instead made decisions that made me more vulnerable. So I was in a very, very vulnerable spot, and I was on a trip. I was living in Israel, and I was like on a 6-week trip back in the United States. And I was going more and more, getting more and more depressed and anxious. And I really felt like I needed to rely on, I guess I needed to rely on God. I didn't think about it that way. I thought I needed to I didn't at the time think I needed to rely on God. It's only that's what I mean. It's only in retrospect that I realized it was the most important time, because I was so vulnerable, and I was trying to hide how depressed I was, and I was trying to just function normally. And I'm a pretty good actor, so I wasn't letting people in, but I was getting more and more depressed. And that's when I realized I had to not just rely on God, but I had to, I guess in retrospect, it's very similar to what happened when I was 12, when Jenny's mother died, and that there was this gaping hole, only this time it felt like it was in my soul. And if I didn't do that thing of praying, asking, begging for the knowledge to know what to do and what to say, I was going to sink into it. The first time it was just, I felt like my friend needed me and I needed to know how to be there for her, and it was a really scary time. But this time was in me. It was a really scary time. And I didn't know how low I would sink. So I really had to ask for that wisdom. I had to believe on some level, as depressed as I was and as meaningless as everything felt, because to me that's the worst part of depression, is that everything is meaningless. And I needed meaning, and I felt that I had to, that if I didn't ask for the wisdom to know how to deal with the situation, I would just keep falling. So I think that's the most important time. I know that's the most important time.
And what happened?
What happened was I told my cousins, I was staying with my cousins. I was on this visit, so I didn't live anywhere. That was the hard time. And I told my cousins what was going on with me. I said, I'm really depressed and things aren't good. I have all this, I basically told them what was going on. After I realized I was just going to keep falling. I told my cousins, and they said, well, you need help. You shouldn't be dealing with this alone. And it was complicated because I was living in Israel and visiting in America and having no health insurance and all the rest, but it turned out what happened is that I learned that my cousin's wife, who's now one of my best friends, also struggled with depression. And she connected with me on it, and she helped me through it, and eventually she got me an appointment with a therapist who would see me in New York, and we worked it all out. And eventually, after a few weeks, I was able to go back to Israel with the knowledge of like how to get some antidepressant medication and how to go to therapy and how to try to put myself back together. But the most important part was that connection I made with my cousin, who, by telling her what was going on with me. A lot of times, there have been a lot of times that have not felt, it's not that they felt as important, because that one felt life-saving. But for me, always when I go to Jerusalem, I have amazing experiences that remind me of the presence of God. And it's very strange for me. I wrote about this in my spiritual autobiography. When we finish rabbinical school in our senior year, we write a spiritual autobiography. I wrote about this, and it's interesting because it's still confusing to me. That was 1995 when I wrote that. That theoretically, in my theology, you said we wouldn't talk about theology. No place is more sacred than any other place. Because I think that's what I believe. That's what I choose to believe. But at the same time, when I'm in Jerusalem, specifically Jerusalem, not anywhere else in the Holy Land, I started calling Israel and Palestine the Holy Land, not because I think it's so holy. I mean, I think all places are holy, but because a friend of mine there said that, who is Palestinian, said he uses the term the Holy Land because the land is holy to so many people, and if you call it the Holy Land, then you don't have to worry about boundaries and which is Israel, which is Palestine, blah, 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 and that works for me very nicely. And I feel like the place is holy, and that is part of the issue of why so many people are fighting over it. But I struggle with the fact that although I don't believe theoretically that any place is holier than any others, whenever I'm in Jerusalem, amazing things happen that have to do with Jerusalem, and I know they don't have to do just with me. They have to do with the place. And once I was on a trip with 6 people. It was right after the Second Intifada started. There were all of these Jewish people that were going on solidarity missions to be on solidarity with Israel. And I thought it would be really important to go on a solidarity mission in solidarity with people who are still committed to peace, be they Israeli or Palestinian, because there was such a rupture when there had been more collaboration. So we ended up only 6 of us on this trip in 2001. And so the people that were on the trip with me kept saying, oh, amazing things would happen. We would go meet somebody in the old city of Jerusalem that had been planned, and then we would talk to them and do whatever we were going to do, and then out of nowhere would appear the exact next right person for us to meet, who would exactly answer the questions that had come up in the first conversation. And then Larry, this friend of mine who was on the trip, kept saying, Rebecca, you're amazing. I said, it's not me. It's Jerusalem. I'm doing nothing. We're meeting people, and then the next right person shows up. And it's always like that. It's always like that in Jerusalem. When I was there at the end of that year when I was so depressed and I was getting ready to come back to America, it was my mother's yahrzeit. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I wanted to do something important to mark it. So I went to the old city because I just really liked to be there. And I figured the right thing would happen, and I just sort of wandered around. And then I ran into a woman I had met 10 months previously. She said, oh, Shlomo Carlebach is here. I said, what are you doing here? She doesn't live in Jerusalem. She said, oh, Shlomo Carlebach is here. He's doing a wedding. Have you ever seen him do a wedding? Do you want to come? And so I went to this wedding, and Shlomo was there singing, and I found his presence, Alav Hashalom, so uplifting, and it was just so the right place for me to be. And things like that always happen to me when I'm in Jerusalem, and I can't explain why. There's no explanation. And sometimes they're painful, but they're always meaningful. This chai that I wear, it's another one of those things where I really, really strongly felt the presence of God. Last summer I was in Israel, and I went on a day trip to Hebron, and it was a really, really special trip run by this guy named Eliyahu McLean. I don't know if you know him. So we spent half the day in the Jewish section of Hebron and half the day in the Palestinian section, and it was a wonderful day. So we were sitting in it was a very painful day, but it was positive. I find positive things in connecting with people. So it's not that there wasn't horrible pain at how much military presence is there, but we were sitting talking to the Jews of this guy who runs a museum in memory of the Jews who were killed in the massacre in 1929 in Hebron. And a friend of mine that I was with asked him, wouldn't it be a good idea? He said some of the Arabs did save Jews, but not enough. And my friend David said, don't you think it would be a good idea to put at least the names of the Arabs who did save the Jews? It would be good for us as Jews to see that. Like at Yad Vashem, how they list all the righteous Gentiles. It would be good for us as Jews to see it. And it would be good for the world to see that, so he gave all these reasons why it was good. The guy didn't listen. We all went back to Jerusalem. And then a few days later, I was walking around, and I just walk around the old city of Jerusalem, and I know a lot of people there every time I go there. But I was walking with Yen, and we were speaking Danish, as we usually do when we're somewhere where we don't want to be overheard easily. And that guy calls out, Danish? He says, Dansk. He said, oh, are you from Denmark? He said that his nephew was engaged to a Danish girl and was trying to learn Danish, and it was so hard for him. So we started to chat, and he had a jewelry store where we got this. And so we started talking, and I asked him if he was from Jerusalem originally. He said no, he was from Hebron. I said, oh, I was just there the other day. And I told him what I was doing there. And he brought us in to his shop, and he said, my grandparents saved Jewish families in 1929, just like my friend David had been saying they should put up. And he showed me he had in Hebrew, he had a certificate from the state of Israel thanking his family for being among the Arabs of Hebron who saved Jewish families. So we got into this long conversation. He gave us tea, and we stayed there for hours. We became friends with him, and eventually Yen went back and bought this for me there. But no, that's not even what happened. I wanted a chai, and so I thought I'd get it from him. And I couldn't choose which one I wanted, and I told him I was going to Bethlehem to meet my friend Sammy on Monday. He said, well, why don't you wear that chai and see if it suits you? And if it does, when you come back from Bethlehem, you'll buy it. And if not, you'll get another one. He had so much trust for me. So I did that. And then we went back. And actually, as it happened, the day we got back, it ended up being too late. And I didn't know how to reach him. And I didn't want him to think, we had blown him off. So somehow I found his card, and I called him, and he wasn't there, but I said, please tell, Abraham was his name, that we're coming tomorrow. So we went the next day, and he said, do you want to look around and buy another one? I said, no, I want this one, because it signifies to me how much you trusted me. So, things like that don't happen to me anywhere else. Maybe they would. Maybe there's something I'm open to there and I'm not open to here. But I just can't imagine the things that happen to me there happening anywhere else. Maybe there's something about the fact that there's this horrible war that's been going on for as long as I've been alive. And yet every time I go there, I make a very deep, important friendship with someone that's supposedly my enemy. I don't know. Every day. Every day I doubt my faith. I more doubt than believe. I doubt, well, I shouldn't say that way. Let me figure out how I formulate it. I know that there is, I choose to believe that there is something out there that is much, much greater than animal life on the planet. But I doubt often what is the form of that power and how are people supposed to relate, whether it's God or not, whatever you call it. I prefer to use it, but that sounds so disrespectful, but I don't mean it that way. Because I doubt all the time, I have so many doubts because belief, the state of faith and belief in the world today brings more and more pain and unhappy outcomes. And yet I know that belief and faith can bring meaning and joy and love and amazing outcomes. My doubt is in the form of, what are we doing? Like, what are humans doing? I mean, not me personally. What are we doing wrong that faith or belief is causing so much pain and agony and death and destruction? So that's where my doubts come from. They don't come from personal doubt. I have doubts about my own. I have my own doubts about what I believe. I never believe there's nothing more than just, what we can see and touch. I always, because I remember my experiences, and it's not that I never doubt it, but when I do doubt it, I remember my experiences and the doubts go away. But what to do about it is what I doubt. I know somebody who became an atheist, a rabbi who became an atheist. And he's like big time into this Jewish humanistic movement now. And he's posting about it in Facebook all the time. So I said something about that a lot of rabbis would doubt the existence of God in the terms of the God that, we're always talking about. I said, but if there were fewer expectations on us to talk about God, and if we had more freedom to talk about, sort of Mordechai Kaplan-like version of God being the power that brings out the best in us, that would work for me. And his response to me was like, no, I'm not talking about that. That's bullshit. I'm talking about like there's nothing, no God, zero. And that was really good for me to hear because I realized I'm not in his camp. I'm not. And I know where there's some group of ex-clergy. They're still functioning as clergy, but they've stopped believing. And I realized, no, that's not where I am. My doubts are, I doubt the God of the liturgy. I doubt the importance of any liturgy whatsoever. Sometimes I doubt why we say certain prayers at certain times. So then I realized my doubts are about the religion. My doubts are not about faith or God and I doubt God, but that's because I don't like the word God. I don't like sometimes the connotations, of what we mean when we talk about God today, the wars that happen over God. But they're not my, like, truly deep doubts. That hasn't happened to me for a while. I don't really call it anything except sometimes I'll call it God just because that's the word I know. At the most, I'm American English speaking, God, like, comes easily, but really my concept of God is not a being. I have tried to, there's a period I was working with a teacher, I tried to do, Hispodadus, the like one-on-one Hasidic talking to God. And that's hard for me because I don't see God as a being that listens with ears. I see, to me, the God, probably Mordechai Kaplan did come closest for me in saying that God is the power that makes for salvation, even though those words don't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. I've worked with them for so long. To me, it means that God is the power that is greater than the sum of any human capability, that if we tap into it, we become better people, and if we collectively tapped into it, we could do amazing things with the talents we've been given. It's also very much connected to, I would say that as much as I don't like theology, the two theologians that I resonate with the most are Kaplan and also Martin Buber, because the idea of creating every moment with another person, or, Buber talked even about experiencing it with a horse when he was a child, having an I and thou moment, and with my dog I have a lot of I and thou moments, but the idea that, any interaction has the potential of being I, it, or I, thou, that to me is where God is. I remember a day, again, it happened to have been in Jerusalem, but I think about it because I was doing some spiritual direction, and so the person I was working with asked me a moment when I felt like I saw God, had a God experience, and it had been Yom Kippur of 1993 when I was in Israel the first time as a rabbinical student, and my mother had died 2 years previous, so that was still very fresh. And I don't like sitting in services. I really don't. I get bored. I get bored leading services, but I wanted it to be a meaningful day for me. It was Yom Kippur. I was in Jerusalem. So it was very early in the morning, and I went to take a walk. And I just kept walking and walking, and I realized a lot of people were walking and walking, and they were all dressed in white, and they were all sort of streaming towards the old city. And I started walking up the outside steps towards where you can, the gate is to the Armenian quarter, and I passed the Armenian cemetery going into the old city, and there's all these people wearing white. There's a lot of people. It's Yom Kippur in Jerusalem, and there was a man sitting outside of the Armenian monastery, and I looked at him, and I realized like all these people were just walking by him. And I looked at him, and I smiled at him, and he smiled at me and said, Chag Sameach, in Hebrew. And that was Yom Kippur to me. That was just somebody who's sitting at this Armenian church. I don't even know if he was Armenian, maybe he was Palestinian, it was his just job to guard the thing, but he knew it was my holiday, and he was saying Chag Sameach to me, and that was such a God experience for me that I didn't need to do anything else that day. So that's really I think that's my only theology. I think that's why community is so important to me. And I think that's probably why, back when my mother was widowed and I said I'm not going to let one person become so important that I'll fall apart. I mean, I just think finding God in the interactions with other people is a lot of why we're here. So I guess that's what I believe. I'm most grateful. I'm grateful for a lot. Gratitude is a big part of my spirituality for me. What I'm most grateful for, that's that's hard. Can it just be right now? What I'm most grateful for right now, sort of on a daily basis, this last little bit, is that my life is not having to get up and go to a job that I don't like to do, and that my world is not divided into having to spend a lot of time doing something distasteful just to earn money for the rest of my life. I'm really grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the people in my life. And I'm grateful for the technology that makes it possible for me to live so far from so many of them and yet feel so connected on a daily basis. Because I couldn't have the life that I have today that I'm so grateful for, I could not have had 10 years ago without the technology. So I'm really aware of that. My greatest wish is to live a lot longer and be healthy. That's really my greatest wish. I'm very afraid of getting sick and dying young, and my greatest wish is to live a lot longer and be healthy. A long time ago, not that long ago, but maybe 10 years ago, somebody asked me once, they said, I'm going to drink water first. That's my message, drink water. It's really good. But I guess it was about 10 years ago, somebody said to me, they think that every clergy person has one sermon that is their main sermon that they're preaching wherever they're going. And what it asked me what mine was. And I answered it at the time, and I realized that this is still true. So this is probably my message. It's also what I put in my vision statement when I was ordained. We each had a little vision statement. It has to do with Psalm 118, because there's so much in that psalm that I think is part of my message. One of them is that, can I take Psalm 118?
Yeah.
Is that okay if I just grab it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You want me to give you your Tanakh?
Yeah, because I'm so afraid I'll be a little bit nervous and it's long, just to but there's so much Psalm 118, if I had to pick a text, expresses so much of what I believe, but just give me 2 seconds. You can just cut all this out, right? That's the great thing about tape. Here. Okay. I just had it. It is that, the first part, it's not the first part of the Psalm, but there's a part in Psalm 118 that says, Evan Masu Habonim Haital Rosh Pinah, that the stone that the builders rejected will become the cornerstone. And I understand that to mean that it is really up to us as individuals, as generations, to look around us at our traditions and choose the foundation ourselves. And it doesn't have to be what was previously approved. But it's still a stone, so it's still something it's foundational. It was always there. It's not like we're making a plaster cast. I mean, we're taking the tradition, but we're also allowed to rebuild it. And then Psalm 118 also talks about opening the gates to go meet God. And it says that the gate of justice is how we go to meet God. That you can't really meet God without there being justice. That creating a just society for human beings to live in is a gateway to meeting God, and that anybody who thinks that they can own slaves or pay people slave wages or keep women, oppress women, that any of these things that people do to one another, we can't really be meeting God, and if our society isn't just. And then it says, today is the day God made, let us rejoice and be glad in it. So it's always today. I mean, whenever you say Zeh Hayom Aseh Adonai, it's always, today is the day God made, and our job is to rejoice and be glad that today exists. It doesn't mean every day will be that way, because days are hard. It just means every day has that potential. And I feel like that is a way. The reason I feel like that is my message is that I have struggled with painful things. Some of them were internal, I mentioned the depression. Some of them, the early death of my parents and the death of a lot of people that were important to me. And I tend to really struggle, where I really struggle with doubting my faith, is when I see the horrible things human beings do to one another. And so when I remember that justice, that the gateway to God is also partly through justice, it doesn't become that old argument of, you're going to be a communist and want to make a just world, but it's godless, or, there can be justice and God, and in fact, justice is a gateway to God. And when we do that, then we're happy, not by amassing wealth. So I guess that's my message. One of the things I've learned living in Malmö, I've lived now in Sweden for 1.5 years, that when I first got here, I was complaining that the kind of Jewish community that I want, that I crave, cares deeply about Jewish tradition, but is also egalitarian and inclusive. It didn't exist, and I didn't want to be here. And now, as you've seen, it's starting to exist, and that the creative potential in people, I think, is what makes me continue to believe. The creative potential in people to connect with one another and create positive things, especially community experiences. And I'm really honored to be part of that. It's a really great experience. There's one thing I would like to share, but I don't know if it needs to be in anything, but just in case, because I haven't said it. Something that I struggle with about religions, I don't struggle with it myself in my own faith, so I want to make that distinction. Religions struggle a lot with sex and sexuality all the time. As part of every religion to deal with sexuality, which isn't surprising because it's, in general, is a structure that people have, and structures deal with human sexuality because I think it's very frightening not to try to control it. So governments do it, religions do it. I think it's a huge challenge that we have today. When I see what's happening, the Catholic Church is very in the news all the time, but there just was a lot of news about a lot of rabbis and sexual abuse. And then in a lot of other Christian churches, there's a lot of homophobia. I mean, there's a lot of bad blood between sexuality and religion. Is that, and I would just like to see the way that people who people who think about faith and people who deal with faith communities in whatever form I've seen some wonderful transformations in my lifetime in the last, say, 30 years since I've been an adult in terms of being inclusive of people with different sexual orientation. First it was gay people, it's trans people. I've seen a lot of confrontation with the difficult stuff, with sexual abuse cases. I just hope people who deal in religious community and faith community continue to have the strength to be open about having the conversations. Because I think the painful part comes when it's all suppressed. And I think having conversations about it will be more liberating for everybody and maybe be the cause of less abuse and pain. And I just realized that hadn't come up, but that's important to me. So.
Well, Rebecca, thank you for doing this.
It was hard.
Great.
It was really hard.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. It was harder than you could imagine because of living here now. I mean, I used to have conversations all the time in America, but you don't talk about this sort of thing in Sweden. Very secular society. So, thank you.